All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our South Carolina Ag Disruptors webinar. I'm Kevin Burkett of the Clemson Extension Agribusiness Team, joined by my co-host Scott Mickey of the Clemson Extension Agribusiness Team. And this is our monthly webinar where we touch on topics that could have a significant impact on the producers of South Carolina, things that we call possible disruptors to their operation. Could be good things, could be bad things, but just things that we felt like would be topics of interest. Sometimes they're new and emerging topics, but otherwise we felt like things that were just important to talk about. So for today's presentation, we have Ryan Bean, who's a forestry and wildlife agent, and he's come to talk about pine straw production in the state, which I wouldn't say is a new topic per se, but as we think about it, it could be a potential revenue stream for landowners and farm owners. And I think in the last couple of years, they've started some workshops that have been very popular and I think well attended, and Ryan will probably speak to that some. But again, just felt like this was a topic that could be of interest to the producers of South Carolina and want to promote some of the other programs that are going on. So we appreciate Ryan being on with us. And with that, I will just turn it over to him.
Thanks, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. So as Kevin was saying there, pine straw is definitely not a new market here in South Carolina. It's been going pretty strong for many years, but it's kind of caught more attention or publicity. People are finally catching on to how much money they can bring in from their property as far as additional income that may not be realized otherwise. And some people are changing their strategy on which species of trees they're planting based on this information once they finally see how much it could mean for them. Timber has always been a long-term investment. So when you start talking about putting trees in the ground and then waiting, 15 years or so for the first thinning, you're really putting a lot of money on the table and waiting for a long-term return. So anything you could do in the interim to kind of help that come back to you is always advantageous. This program we started putting together back in 2018 to 2019. Ended up offering it twice in 2019, just about a month apart from each other. The first one was in September of 19 at Sandhill Research Station, and had a field tour with it both times. But the first one sold out, and we had a full 40 or so people waiting for it then. So we knew it was going to be popular, but we didn't quite know it was going to be that popular. But since then, we've offered it in webinar format, of course, today, as well as during the COVID timeframe. And we held another one back in March of this year up in Chesterfield County, and we've got plans to offer it in other parts of the state as well. Just like those field tours really are a benefit for any landowners that are actively engaged or interested in getting engaged into actually seeing what the process looks like on the ground. And we've been lucky. We've had several contractors participate in those field tours as well. So it's helped to kind of shed light on any kind of questions that people are asking during those field tours that we aren't, or maybe aren't able to answer due to their kind of the nature of the question. But in any case, this presentation I'm going to show here this morning, the first one anyway, is something that was developed by Dr. Dave Coyle. He's our forest health and invasive species specialist on campus. Dave does a really great job of transferring information to the end user. And so we've tried to keep him involved in this program, especially from the forest health side of things. And as you'll see here in a minute, there are some forest health concerns when you start raking pine straw, but those can be mitigated fairly easily. But without too much rambling, I'll go ahead and get started here. So a few basics of pine straw. Economic impact is #1 ground cover in the Southeast. There's not a whole lot of information about the actual numbers in South Carolina. They've tried to quantify it, but as you can probably imagine, a lot of these deals are cash deals, handshake contract type situation, people showing up, raking the straw, getting paid right there on the spot. So it's a lot more difficult to track the economic impact. There have been several people that have tried to kind of quantify that. In North Carolina and Georgia, they've done it. And you can see there in North Carolina, they came up with somewhere over $35 million. And then 60 million total impact, through the labor and so on and so forth. In Georgia, it was a 60 to $80 million impact directly to the landowners. So we're talking big numbers here. There's a lot of money being made from this market. And of course, the figure there from Georgia, 60 to $80 million paid to the landowners. That's at about let's just say round numbers, about $1 per bale. So if you extrapolate that out and go all the way, you're talking some people are charging $4.50 a bale all the way up to $5 and $6 a bale. That number gets a lot bigger, a lot quicker. So it is a really big business. Florida, you can see there's nearly $80 million industry. The other southeastern states have put some information together, but it just hasn't been quantified and published like it has in the other states where I could share it with you this morning. Anything that's worth imitating is must be something good, right? So here you can see this company called Textraw, and they make synthetic pine needles. So just going back to kind of proving out that it is something that is a big market. If it's worth somebody coming and finding a way to make it synthetically when it's abundantly available in a natural form, kind of sheds light on how advantageous it could be to have it on your property. There are several types of pine straw we can talk about. Longleaf pine is the primary source of pine straw for landscape use. It's the best quality, highest demand. You're going to see somewhere, from a landowner's perspective, you're going to see somewhere in that 60 cents to $1.20 per bale paid at your land. You produce somewhere between 100 to 200 bales per acre, but you can be on the lower end of that. You could be quite a bit higher than that as well. You see there about 400 bales per acre has been recorded as well. Slash pine can be used as well. That's mostly down in the Florida area. It's the second highest demand in quality. It has very similar needles to the longleaf pine. It retains its color for a long period of time, like longleaf does. A little bit lower quality overall, though. Typically more trash in it, and that kind of just stems from the type of limbs that the slash pine has compared to longleaf pine. Longleaf pine limbs tend to stay larger diameter all the way out to the tips, so it makes it a lot easier to get the trash and debris out of the straw. Whereas with slash pine, and like we'll see in a second, loblolly pine, the twigs and sticks are a whole lot harder to get out of the straw, so you end up with more debris. Loblolly pine, like I just mentioned, it's the worst quality. It's the lowest demand. There is some demand for it, and you can sell it a lot of times. Your big box stores, if you're not real careful on what you're buying, you may be buying pine straw, not necessarily long needle pine straw. And just make sure if anyone's looking at buying at a big box store, they're aware of what they're purchasing. But from the grower side of things, you're looking at 25 cents to 50 cents per square bale. It's worth noting that those square bales do change in size, so make sure that's something you're looking at too. I believe I'll touch on that here in just a minute. Produce an average of 150 to 275 bales per acre, so the production is a little bit higher, so you can kind of get closer to evening out. But again, the demand is just so much lower that I would encourage anyone to plant loblolly pine with the intention of raking straw from it. So the cost to the consumer, as I mentioned earlier, about $4 a square bale from a big box store. Some of your specialty stores, you can get a little bit lower cost or very close to it because they're buying in such bulk and providing it directly to you, and they don't have as much overhead, that kind of thing. The transportation is a little bit lower. But you can get just about anything you want from those specialty stores. Your landscaping places that carry, rock and stone and plants and all that kind of stuff usually have a trailer there on site. Online, yeah, believe it or not, you can buy it online, somewhere between $5 and $10 more or more. You can get on Amazon and buy a box of it, and they'll ship it to your door. It's kind of hard to believe, but they definitely do it. Delivered and installed varies greatly. It can be as low as $3.75. I've never seen anything that low here in South Carolina. Typically, we're paying somewhere around $6 per bale installed, which is really easy for me to justify. I haven't done it at my place when I know how much it costs to buy the bales at $4.50 a bale. It's pretty easy to justify paying somebody $1 to go stick a bit and to throw each bale out for you. So how do we get it done? How does the straw get into those bales? How do we get to the store, and how do we sell it? So hand raking is the primary mode of action here. There are some mechanical means coming about, and there is here lately been a shift to a mechanical method, and there's a lot driving that. But the primary reason that we're seeing more of a shift to mechanical is, return on your investment is can be a little bit higher. But the reason it's really kind of caught on lately is the additional stresses that have been on trying to get migrant workers in. It's just been increasingly more difficult to get those workers to be able to come into the country and work for the time period that they're needed. So these contractors moving to mechanical means is just part of the situation. This is what your typical box baler could look like. Most of these guys that are doing this on a regular basis are using metal balers that they built themselves. This one here is pretty heavy and hard to move. It works pretty well. You just take your pine straw, they end up removing the debris, gets piled up. They end up pushing it, closing that front door there, pulling the twine through it, and then putting the pine straw down there and then compacting it. A lot of times, if you ever mess with pine straw, it kind of comes off in chunks. And so each one of those chunks is where they put pine straw in and then compressed it. And that's what really makes it easy to put out and disperse in your landscape beds, is when you have them in those clumps, and you can kind of grab a handful at a time and go shake it out, not end up with just one pile when you cut the baling twine on it. Here's a look at some of those mechanical methods. These are not typical hay balers. You can see there, they're quite a bit smaller. The ones that I've been involved with have been converted from raking rice straw from Japan or China area. And just a few modifications can be made, and they can be made to work pretty efficiently. That top picture there is a typical square baler. From what I understand, they don't work very well. It takes quite a bit of kind of figuring with them, and they can be pretty finicky. They're just not set up for that real fine straw. They're set up for wheat straw, that kind of stuff, to for it to process. The pine straw just kind of creates a fit for it. That's what what we're looking at for the final product. On the left, there's your square bale. There's on average about 15 pounds. On the right-hand side, you've got a round bale, typically about 40 pounds. It's quite a bit larger, quite a bit heavier. One of those round bales is about 2 1/4 to 3 square bales based on the weight and the amount of straw you're getting. The benefit of those round bales is really for the landscapers, especially in new installations. They can cut that outer twine and basically unroll it like a carpet into the flower bed. They do a little bit of fluffing afterwards, but it really makes it easy to unroll that thing, punch a hole in it, stick your landscape plants through it, and keep on rolling. Quite a bit quicker than shaking out bales. I mentioned the online, purchase it from stores. That's what you're seeing here. Pennington's got their version, and then a box of it. That picture was actually from Amazon on the right there. Hand raking is better for natural stands. That kind of just goes to maybe the trees maybe not be in exact rows, so you wouldn't be able to get a piece of equipment straight down the row. So hand raking would fall in better. And if there's any changes in elevation, if you got topography, and typically these longleaf stands in particular are on sandy sites. So if you have any kind of elevation and you've got sandy soil and you are raking or removing a litter from the top of the soil, you're potentially exposing that soil. So any heavy rain storms would potentially cause erosion. So hand raking can be better there because you're not you have a whole lot more control on how much you're removing from on top of that soil, and can leave something behind to help hold that soil together. Mechanical raking is easier when everything's in a good straight row and everything's on flat ground. Just for the same reason I've just described for the hand raking, just being the opposite. So when it comes to selling your straw, most of these things are through contract agreements. And if there's nothing else we talk about today, make sure that you get a contract before doing these things. Too many times you hear about people showing up, walking away with the straw and saying they'll pay you or whatever, and it doesn't come true. Or they rake and tell you what they got, and you were thinking you were going to get a whole lot more. Just make sure you have a contract that specifies, who's doing the work, how often they're doing the work, how much they're removing and how much they anticipate to be removed, and what the conditions should be after the raking has been completed. Selling by the bale or by the acre, this really just comes down to your level or the landowner's level of involvement. If you've got a landowner that doesn't necessarily live on the land, then selling by the acre makes more sense. Selling by the bale, I would highly recommend that someone is nearby and making a check-in and kind of keeping an eye on how many bales are actually leaving the property. Selling by the acre, will you get burned a little bit? Sure. But how much is your time worth? And it's really not that much. If it goes one way or the other, and it really can go one way or the other, especially if you get rainstorms and that kind of thing. The contractor can end up on the losing end, versus, you may lose a few bales that may not have been accounted for in the estimate of what's going to be harvested. But a few more little notes to be aware of there. Round balers are more uniform. Again, just like agriculture, if you're in any other part of agriculture, if you're using a piece of mechanized equipment, you can really kind of hone in on what you're going to be doing, how much you're going to be removing, as well as the size of the bale is going to be very uniform. The hand rake bales I mentioned earlier, the size of the baler comes into play. So make sure you understand what size bale they're using and how that relates to how many bales they could be removing per acre. And then make sure that is specified in that contract. The landowner is often responsible for ensuring the proper bale count. Again, if you are selling by the bale, that falls on you or the landowner to make sure that that is being done properly. So the immigration I mentioned earlier, it's been increasingly more difficult to get these people in here that do the work. Not to say that locals don't do the work as well, but by and large, this work is being done by migrant workers that do other work as well. They move around, they do a whole lot of the tree planting, they do herbicide applications in the dormant season, any mix of things that happen in forestry, natural resources type work that these people are doing. But during the off season, when they're done with herbicide applications or tree planting or whatever, they switch gears and they go rake straw. So they're here doing something all year long and all throughout the Southeast. This is just one part of what they do. But again, like I said earlier, the hand raking obviously requires more labor. You got somebody raking, you got somebody baling, you got somebody hauling and storing those bales. Mechanical, you can get away with one or two guys doing the same kind of work that 4 or 5 or 6 guys that could be doing for the hand raking. As far as regulatory goes, if from the Clemson side of things, we have the Department of Pest Industry, Plant Industry. So anything that is being harvested here in the state and crossing state lines would need to be inspected by the Department of Plant Industry. What they're looking for here is invasive species and or pests. So fire ants are one of the things, Japanese climbing fern, if you've got that around. Anything else that could be moved out of South Carolina into another state that is a noxious weed or pest would need to be taken care of before it's able to be shipped. Typically, the shipper contacts DPI to get certification to bring the commodity into another state. Doesn't necessarily fall on the landowner. DPI reviews that state's regulations, and then if none, the DPI inspects for fire ants and invasive plants. If none found, you're certified, you're good to go. Here's one of the contacts for DPI, Stephen Long. He can get you set up with whoever you need to speak to get that in place. As far as stand management goes, when can we start harvesting straw? About 8 to 10 years from tree planting is when crown closure will start to happen on longleaf pine. And when I start talking here, just bear in mind, I'm talking about longleaf pine. It is the primary driver for this market. So it just makes sense that all the information that I'm providing here is really targeted at longleaf. If you have any questions about loblolly or any other species, I'd be happy to answer those. But all the information I use here is really targeted at longleaf pine. So starting about 8 to 10 years, that crown closure happens. That's when you start to see a measurable pine yield drop that could be harvested. It's really going to be closer to that 10-year-old mark in most cases, though. 8 years old really requires some more kind of holding its hand throughout the first 8 years and making sure everything's set up, make sure you're taking care of competing species, maybe done some prescribed fire work or maybe some herbicide work or bush hogging or mowing or something to keep the weeds down, keep the debris out, and keep it set up for harvesting straw as being your target. Production usually peaks 14 to 16 years old. Again, this is site dependent and environmental conditions dependent, and it typically starts to decline around 18 to 20 years old. And the reason for that decline is if the trees have not been thinned by that point, and that's typically when those trees would be thinned, the crown closures have gotten so tight with each other, the amount of live crown on the trees or the amount of foliage on the trees is reducing due to the competition. So it's time for those trees to be thinned. And then for another 2 or 3 years, you probably won't have a great harvest of pine straw. You could still potentially rake, but most people will have that first thinning done. Some of them will stop raking it after the first thinning and move on to a different management regime. Maybe it's just their aesthetics or hunting or whatever it may be. But after that first thinning, it will be a couple of years before you return to a normal or a close to normal pine straw harvest rate. Again, this does depend on your tree species. Most needles are dropped during August through December. So when you start seeing these things, a lot of times in this time of year, we get phone calls, hey, my trees are turning brown, what's going on with them? But this is normal. It's called senescence of the needles. What you're seeing there on that longleaf pine on the left, up close, is the brown needles that are about to fall. Those are last year's growth, last year's or even a year and a half ago's needle growth. So those will fall off. The new needles are growing out there at the very tip of those branches, and those will be falling a year and a half later. There's a closer look at them there. So I've been mentioning all along, the cleaner the stand, the better for the pine straw production and harvest. Vegetation management is key. So any kind of pasture grasses are going to present problems. Any kind of hardwood trees are going to present problems. And so doing your best to keep those at bay is really going to set you up for success. Anything that's not controlled for this, let's say for this first 8 years, is going to have to be be put under some kind of control and management activity prior to harvesting the straw, because you don't want to have to deal with all that trash in the straw, which is going to reduce the price that you're paid for the bales. So prescribed fire for the first 8 years would be great. It does a good job of limbing up the trees a little bit too, and kind of helping them jump out of the grass stage. But it also helps work on weed management, sweet gum trees or scrub oak trees or anything else that could be popping up. It's going to kind of help keep those at bay. If prescribed fire is not something you can work with, or maybe you're close to a highway or something else, then herbicide is the second choice there. Obviously, it's quite a bit more expensive to do that and requires more or potentially could require more labor depending on how much of a problem you've got. Bottom line is, if it's in the way, it's costing the raker time and money, which is costing you money. Vegetation, branches, etc., all need to be out of there. So for the vegetation control options, herbicide through broadcast, basal bark, or hack and squirt methods all work. Manual, hand pulling and girdling, mechanical, mowing and mulching, prescribed burning, obviously. And there are some situations where grazing can be advantageous, but the problem with grazing is you don't want to do that for the first probably 4 or 5 years. The potential for losing seedlings is quite a bit higher during that time frame. If those trees get up about knee to shoulder high, they can typically the animals will leave them alone or not cause too much damage to them at that point. So vegetation control options, there's any way you can think of to put herbicides out works for the most part. It just depends on what kind of vegetation you're trying to control. We're looking at here is just broadcast application through foliar applications using backpack sprayers, ATV mounted tanks, or even aerial. And there are some drone applications coming out as well. Kind of still on the fence about the effectiveness of some of those, but they are being worked on. Mentioned basal bark applications. when those tree stems start to get more plentiful or start to get a little bit larger in diameter, or maybe even get above your head height, then basil bark could be a better option because you don't have to treat the whole tree through foliar. So, just mixing a horticultural oil or a bark oil with the herbicide allows that herbicide to penetrate the bark and kill those species. Hack and squirt is another method here. Basically, like you're seeing there in the photo, is just make a couple hatchet marks around the diameter of the tree and spray the concentrate directly into those wounds. Tree takes it up through the xylem and phloem and eventually kills the tree as well. A little bit later, less labor intensive than, or even less costly than a foliar application over an entire stand to be able to do these specific species treatments like this. Stump treatments. So if you have the ability to cut those stumps and then treat them, you don't have to, let me look at the pictures here. So on the left-hand side, if that was a small stem, you would treat the whole thing just because it's hard to kind of delineate the outer growing edge of the tree versus that picture on the right. If that's a larger stem, even though that looks like the exact same stump, if it was a larger stem, you only have to treat that outer edge because that's where the growing or the new living tissue is for those trees. That is the pathway for those chemicals to be metabolized by the plant and have effect on them. So just kind of something to keep in mind there. If it's a smaller stem, treat the whole thing as soon as it's cut. And that is very important. As soon as it's cut, it has to be treated. On the right-hand side, large stems can be treated just around the perimeter, again, just as soon as it's cut. As with any time we mention pesticides with extension, we have to make sure we tell you the label's the law, make sure you read the label, make sure you follow all the safety recommendations, so on and so forth. So the common active ingredients, I'll breeze through these. Imazapyr, it's non-selective. Triclopyr is a selective, controls your broadleaf and woody plants, doesn't control your grasses. So this is an advantageous method for those of you that are looking at harvesting pine straw, but also want the native plant communities that would be advantageous for managing for wildlife or something like that, or even just the aesthetics of it, or maybe just for soil erosion purposes. Triclopyr is a great option for that. You can control your sweet gums and other broadleaf plants without harming those native species or grasses. Sulfametron methyl, oust, works on most annuals and perennials. Some woody plants are tolerant and some hardwoods are susceptible. So just another tool in the toolbox. Glyphosate, we've all heard of that. That's an active ingredient in Roundup or Rodeo or Accord. It's a non-selective. Is glyphosate safe? Dave gets on a soapbox about that. I won't go in that today. But all of the research has shown that glyphosate is completely safe to be used when used following the label. I will run through this real quick. They went through some research and looked at how much, if you're looking at the science side of it, how much of the product would have to be consumed to be a problem. So for a 175-pound adult, it's acceptable to take in 0.5 milligram per kilogram per day. If you were to eat Cheerios, an adult would have to eat 1,270 servings or 106 boxes per day to have consumed that much glyphosate residual compound. Other unsafe things, I can just picture Dr. Cole going through this. Driving a car down the road, eating chicken wings, or that guy in the sky that's always shining on us causing cancers. There's a risk is relative. It's all about proper usage. Here's a great resource for managing those invasive plants I mentioned a while ago. This book is not only good for identifying invasive plants, but it has great information for managing them. It's available. You can download it online. You can also purchase it and get a hard copy. But it is a great tool for anyone that's got concerns for invasive plants here in southern forests. Here's another one. This is more detailed on the management side of them. But again, it is available online through that link I've got there. It's a USDA Forest Service publication. You can just search for invasive plants and typically it comes up. Quick tips for invasive plants. will nearly always take multiple years or treatments. That's very important. All time we get people that call in. We give them recommendations for treating these. They come back next year. Hey, it's back. That didn't work. What did we do wrong? What did you tell us wrong? That kind of thing. But these plants have evolved under this regime of they've got to be resilient. They've got to keep fighting back. So we have to be the same way. Any of these applications, whether mechanical or manual or chemical treatments, we've got to be resilient and continue to make that correct applications in order to beat them back. And I won't go through all those. Thinning. We cannot get stuck in the mindset of harvesting pine straw and leaving our stands too long before we thin them. Thinning is a necessary tool for forest management. If we get stuck raking our trees and we don't want to lose any of those that are producing pine straw, we are setting ourselves up for disaster. We are creating what Dr. Coyle refers to as beetle bait. All of those trees are standing out there on sandy soils and in poor environmental conditions and needed to be thinned 10, 15 years ago. They're just screaming, come eat me. So we want to make sure that we're still practicing sound forest management practices, even though we want the most return we can get per acre. It improves the forest health, maintains the tree vigor, provides mid-rotation income from the thin, and the residual slash should be cleaned up. You can burn it, you can pile it in rows, etc. Piling up that slash in rows is great for wildlife. It also allows those nutrients to be slowly returned back into the stand. Burning kind of speeds that process up. Thinning equals more sunlight to the floor, so that does increase vegetation growth on the forest floor, which there in turn might require more control. So again, there is some kind of necessary evil there. You've got to do the thinning to keep trees healthy, and then you're going to have to do a little bit of work to kind of keep that vegetation we've been trying to control. And especially when those trees close in together, you're really not going to have much to control underneath them. But once you open that stand back up, the sunlight's going to create more plants coming up from the forest floor that will need to be controlled prior to harvesting straw again. A lot of times we get this question, should we fertilize our trees? Will it produce more pine straw? And the answer is, it should. The answer of should you is really, it depends. We are removing pine needles, and that is removing nutrients. However, the amount of nutrients we're removing is very negligible. I really would have a hard time telling anybody to fertilize, because if anybody thinks for just a few minutes, if you fertilize your vegetable garden at home or your lawn or whatever it may be, you're not only fertilizing the plants you want to grow, but you're also fertilizing the plants you don't want to grow. So if we're trying to minimize costs and increase profits, if we're spending money on probably the most expensive part of agriculture, in this case being fertilizer, we're also going to increase our input costs on management, reducing those competition plants or those invasive species or whatever else may be coming in, because we are fertilizing them as well as the trees that we're trying to encourage to put on more growth and pine straw. Fertilizer 101. So just real quick, when you're looking at those bags of fertilizer in the store, that NPK stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Potassium is going to be the limiting factor. So, or it's going to be the one that you need to make the most concern with. Nitrogen promotes the plant growth, primarily green tissues. It's found in chlorophyll, moves around in the plant. Phosphorus is critical in root development. So that's especially critical when we start talking about row crops and getting them started. Not so much with trees. However, if you're trying to grow the biggest, largest tree right out of the gate, then you're probably not looking at pine straw to begin with, and phosphorus may be something you want to consider. Potassium is also important for root development and overall plant stress tolerance. Should you fertilize? So it depends on the site. You need to get a soil test. Those can be conducted by get this test yourself and then drop it off at an extension office. And it only costs $6. It takes about a week and a half to get those back, and we can provide you very detailed information for that particular site and what needs to be done for the crop you're growing, in this case, pine trees. So pine straw do's and don'ts: do control the vegetation, do have a contract, know your site, don't bale wet straw, don't damage trees with equipment, don't over rake your stand. And that's where we leave the questions, but I'll hit those last two here. So damaging the trees with the equipment and then over raking. Damaging the trees, anytime we damage a tree, cut a tree, or add to the stress level on trees, they put off a smell or a pheromone. And that pheromone can attract pine beetles. And pine beetles are always out there, they're always around. So any tree in a stand of, if you got one tree and 300 trees out there that's been damaged or a limb's broken off of it or whatever it may be, it puts off a different smell than the tree next to it that's doing just fine. It draws those beetles in. Well, if the stand is stressed overall, but it's just not stressed far enough that it's really real enticing to the beetles, when they come in for that tree that becomes damaged through some kind of mechanical activity or a storm or whatever it may be, lightning can do it too. Those beetles come in for that one, then they start trying to kind of test their limits on the trees next to it, and you can end up losing a handful of trees as a result. So just making sure we reduce the amount of damage that we cause through moving through there with trucks, tractors, equipment, whatever it may be, is always a good practice. As far as not over raking your stand, I kind of touched on it earlier related to reducing erosion on stands with topography. But also when you remove too much straw from the soil, from the stand, a lot of these stands, I've said several times, are on these real high sandy sites. When you've got sand in direct contact with sunlight, the soil heats up at a very high rate, and those feeder roots for those trees are in very close proximity to the top of that soil. So you can very easily damage the root systems on the trees, especially during the summertime when that soil heats up very high. So again, not only just for erosion control, but also as kind of an insulating blanket between the sun and the roots below the soil surface. With that, I'm done with that presentation. How are we doing on time? We all right on time, Kevin?
Yeah, we still got some time. And yeah, just as a reminder for anybody that would like to submit questions, if you submit those through chat, we can relay those to Ryan. But yeah, if you got something else you want to cover for a few minutes, that should be fine. If not, that's okay too. And I had just one or two follow-up questions.
I've got one more little presentation I was going to show and kind of breeze through because it touches on when we did these programs in person back in 2019, any of the kind of overarching questions that we got in the surveys that we give after our programs, we try to make sure we addressed them in this presentation. So if y'all don't mind, it's a real short presentation. I can kind of breeze through it, and hopefully it'll kind of help answer some of those questions that may come up.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. And you may have touched on it already. Do you currently have any upcoming in-person workshops, or you're still kind of planning those?
I don't have any upcoming right now. The last one we did was actually part of the Sandhills Longleaf Conservation Partnership up in Chesterfield County. They needed an educational program. I suggested pine straw. They kind of fought it a little bit because it didn't seem to fit within the conservation practices, but after looking at the information we provide, and really we try to look at it from the side of managing the stand for forest health as well as for multiple purpose management for wildlife and aesthetics and forestry and everything in between, not necessarily just coming in and raping and pillaging the whole site over and over and over. So we try to do the best job we can to encourage sound forest management practices when we start talking about pine straw too. All right, so we should be seeing a slide there. First harvest, canopy closure about 8 years old. I talked about contracts earlier. These contracts are typically 5 years. The reason you want a contract for multiple years is the market's going to fluctuate. And so if you can get a contract in there, it's going to kind of help keep you where you would negotiate to be, but you also don't want that contract to be, you don't want somebody showing up on your front doorstep and saying, hey, let me come rake your straw. I'll do it for X number of dollars, but we can renegotiate your price or whatever. But I want a contract for 20 years. Well, the problem with 20 years is your stand could change, your management objectives could change. So having a shorter contract allows you to kind of renegotiate the terms and kind of keep everything kind of fluid. And also, if the guy that's doing the work for you, the contractor's doing the work for you, isn't really your favorite, it allows you a way out after a shorter term. So just keep that in mind, because we have run into certain situations where contracts have been put in place for a longer period of time. Just kind of not necessarily because it was a bad thing, it's just all the things weren't kind of thought out. I don't think anybody should have any CRP stands still under contract, but if they do have a CRP stand, a longleaf pine, you cannot rake under contract. Just something important to know there. As far as increasing your rate of return, so the financial analysis that have been done show that without pine straw, your rate of return is somewhere between 5.5 to almost 10% without pine straw, just on forest management practices alone. So that's probably on a longleaf stand, you're talking a first thinning and probably a second and third thinning before you do that final harvest. The final harvest would probably be about 40, 45 years after planting. So you're looking at somewhere between 5.5 to 10% return on your investment. If you add pine straw to that on an annual cycle, just one time a year, you're increasing that rate of return to somewhere between almost 9 to 16%. So pretty easy numbers to look at there to make a decision. Something else to consider there, between 2000 and 2009, the income received increased fivefold. Inversely, timber income decreased by 40% during that same time frame. So timber prices have been slowly declining over time. It's been kind of a result, especially the last couple of years. You can all kind of relate it to the COVID and the housing market. Without the housing starts ever getting back to where we were back in the 2005, 2006 timeframe before that first market crash, we're just not ever going to get back to those timber prices again, is from my estimation. But the market for pine straw is steadily increasing. So it is a good market to get involved with as far as we can tell. Let's see here, next slide. As far as estimating how many bales per acre you should be able to harvest, on the left there, you've got a column that says basal area. Basal area is a forestry measurement that looks at the square footage represented if you went and cut down every tree at 4.5 foot above the ground and measure the surface area of that, what would be a stump. So if on 1 acre you had a basal area of 80 square feet, that means if you measured that cut surface of all of the trees on that acre, it would represent 80 square foot. That's a pretty low basal area. That's typically before final harvest. That's like, most stands I would relate that to being a real heavily, being real heavy on the wildlife management objective side of things. Typically your stands are going to be in that 100 basal area, and then right before thinning, you should touch on 120 to 140. 120 is kind of the sweet spot before thinning and for pine straw production from what we've seen. So if a bale weighs about 15 pounds per bale, and you've got a side index, let's keep it on the bottom end here. Let's say you're at 60 side index and you're at 100 basal area. You should expect to see somewhere between or somewhere right around 2,500 pounds per acre of pine straw. Do the math on that, and you're looking at a substantial number of bales per acre, well over 100. So that chart there just gives you a pretty quick way of estimating what you could be looking at with your stand conditions. If you've got people that are interested in this and want to have a better idea of what kind of basal area you're looking at, our foresters with Clemson Extension all over the state are willing to come out and take a look at what you've got and help you make that estimation. Typical bale size, we talked about weights earlier, but typically that size is going to be somewhere 13 by 13 by 28, and they can be upwards of 25 to 30 pounds per bale instead of 15. So again, going back to the contract, just make sure it's understood what size bale and weight you're looking at removing so that you can estimate or negotiate the price you're selling for. Average price of the landowner, $50 to $1.25. And I didn't touch on it earlier. The reason for that lower end is the first year or two that you start harvesting, that contractor is going to have to do some cleanup. Pine cones are going to be on the ground, sticks and twigs are going to be on the ground. There's going to be some vegetation in there. Anything they have to do is going to reduce your price. And in some cases, that first year of harvesting, they may even do the work and not pay you anything, but they're doing the work to clean the stand up so that a year two, you do see a higher return on what you're harvesting, and you're not having to come out of pocket for the work they're doing, which in just about every case I would say is advantageous to the landowner. Average yields there, we touched on that earlier. Longleaf is in that 100 to 350 range. Typically 100 to 200 is a more normal range to shoot for. Income there, therefore, would be somewhere between $50 up to $432 per acre. Most people would be somewhere closer to the, $150, $200 per acre per year. Return on your or investment, revenue per acre. Factors affecting that price received: the clean understory, good road access, and importantly there, the proximity to local markets. So if you're in the middle of Bamberg County, South Carolina, you may not have the proximity to markets that someone in Lancaster or Chesterfield might have, with Charlotte and the suburbs surrounding Charlotte being huge purchasers of pine straw. But that part of the state, the Aiken and Edgefield and that lower edge of South Carolina, their market is coming from Savannah and Atlanta. Let's see here. So what's the cost? Benefits of raking early. So we want to encourage people to rake pine straw early. We mentioned earlier that the pine straw starts falling August and ends somewhere around in December. If you can harvest that pine straw somewhere in September, before needle drop finalizes, what's going to happen is you're going to get a good return, and you're also going to have straw that continues to fall, which provides that buffer from the sun to the soil, as well as reduces erosion. So it's going to cost you a little bit. You're going to lose a little bit of your harvest, but the benefits to that stand, I believe, should far outweigh the amount of income you're losing by leaving that pine straw behind. There you can see a few more bullet points on what the additional benefits are. So looking at what it's going to cost, we did the study looking over at Sandhill Rec. If we harvested the straw, we were getting somewhere around $217 per acre per year from one raking. And if we harvested the straw sooner in the, if we harvested the straw early, that's what we were getting. And if we harvested the straw later on in the year, just to quantify how much was falling on the ground, it was costing us on that this particular side anyway, about $77 per acre to leave that straw behind. Now, that is a substantial number. I wouldn't want to leave that much behind. So we could have adjusted our timing, but also we'd have to bear in mind that this stand is about 25, 26 years old, never been thinned. And the area we raked was probably the most productive part of that stand. So I would have to say that most people would be looking at $50 or less per acre of additional costs that you're losing. But $50 per acre, in my mind, is a good peace of mind that I know that my stand is in better condition moving forward. Again, going through fertilization, should you fertilize? Well, it depends. Will it increase production? Potentially. The increases are somewhere between 25 to 40%. But again, that's just talking about pine straw increases, not the return on the investment, because you're investing the fertilizer, you're also investing in additional vegetation control operations. And so your return on that investment of the fertilizer may not be as much as 25 to 40. Let's see here. So So the pine straw here, I was talking earlier about the pine straw and how much you're actually removing in nutrients from the stand being negligible. So this chart here shows typical longleaf pine nutrient concentrations found in fresh pine straw expresses a percentage of oven dry weight. So you can see, looking at that chart there, that the amount that you're removing from the stand is going to be very low, just based on the decimals you're looking at there. That kind of proves out my statement I made earlier about having a real hard time encouraging anyone to fertilize for pine straw production because of the additional costs that come along with it, and really the low amount of nutrients that you're actually removing from the stand. Let's see here. In order to calculate whether or not you need to apply fertilizer, there is a specific process for that. It's not based on soil tests, it's based on foliage tests. And the way that that's done is you have to use a shotgun, shoot a limb off a tree. Someone has to catch that limb before it hits the ground and immediately bag it up and then send it off to a private lab. This is not a test that Clemson University or other universities can do through their labs. It is a private lab only thing, so it can cost a couple $100 to have the test done. But it will give you a concentration of nutrients in that living tissue on the tree to let you know at what level you are at compared to the sufficiency levels that are shown in this chart here. And given that information, you can make amendments to get those trees up to their sufficiency level or above to increase the production. In any case, the maximum recommended single application of fertilizer rates for longleaf are in the 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen, 60 pounds of potash, and 60 pounds of potassium. I'm sorry, phosphorus and then potassium, sorry. 100 pounds of calcium and 25 pounds of magnesium. So really, again, if we're comparing this to row crop application rates, you're on the low end. You're really not putting a whole lot back out there, and this is at the maximum recommended single application rates. So I just have a real hard time convincing anybody it's worth the effort. Here's some of those labs I mentioned that can do the foliage tests. And if anybody needs this information, I can make it available. We have a folder online that can be shared too. Blowing through this chart here, give the trees room to grow. Make sure we do that thinning I mentioned earlier. It's going to provide health for the trees moving forward. Allow those trees to continue to grow, put volume on, which is going to be what you want at the end of rotation to get the most return on your trees as an investment. Rake once a year, not twice a year. Again, just trying to provide the health to the forest stand by leaving something behind. Rake only the red straw. Try to keep people from raking all the way down to the soil. Allow time to rest, rake, and burn. So I didn't really touch on that here because we weren't talking about the wildlife side of things, but you want to consider especially if you're managing for wildlife and other resources, that you could best if you're stand. Let's say you had 100 acres, you could bust it up into 3 rotations. So you'd have one rotation of 33 acres of this year you'd rake it, next year you'd rest it, and the next year you'd burn it, and then you go through that process again. What you have happen in there is you always have something for food, for cover, and then something to harvest the straw off of. Works out really well for the forest health side of things, also really well for your native plants, and then also for your wildlife species. Fertilization we talked about, and use caution during droughts. Again, drought is just another stress on trees, and if we're in there raking pine straw, we're just adding to that stress. I made one of these boxes. I wouldn't recommend anybody else do it unless you really just want to have a woodworking project. You can buy baler boxes through, I've seen them on Facebook Marketplace pretty regularly. People are making them. They range anywhere from $200 to $300 each. They have wheels on them. They're metal. They're a whole lot easier to move around, and they more closely mimic the same size of baler boxes that you would see a contractor using too. This box here makes a fairly large bale. It comes out definitely above 20 pounds, whereas most of those contractors are shooting for 15 to 20 pounds, but a little bit on the lower end, a little bit easier for people to move around and store and sell.
Yes, sir.
There's a picture of the baler boxes from Facebook Marketplace there. That one was for $320. Pretty nifty little machine, works out really well, easy to move around, lightweight, a whole lot better than that wooden one. And that's all I've got on that presentation.
All right. Yeah, Ryan, we appreciate it. And yeah, just as a reminder for any participants, if you'd like to ask a question of Ryan, you can go ahead and submit that through chat and we can go through those the next couple minutes. I had a follow-up question or two. With the mechanical harvesting, is that something where you can use something as small as like a lawnmower, or you really need to have like a piece of machinery that can run like a PTO?
So you're going to need potentially both. A lot of the times when they're raking the straw into the windrows that they can come back with a baler, a lot of times they have a little lawn tractor they've equipped with an adapted small rake type of equipment. And that works out pretty well. But as far as the baler goes, it is a PTO driven baler. So you will need a small farm tractor, and all of them are small. The largest tractors I see out there are, some of the Kubotas that I've seen are, some of them are full wheel drive, but they're still compact tractors in the grand scheme of things. And those are typically used to haul the trailers that have they load all the bales onto and take them to the 18 wheelers to transfer them.
Yeah, I didn't know if there was like a trade-off between having something small enough that you can get kind of in your stand, but then also having the ability to run some of that machinery as well. So, but if you did it with like a lawnmower, you're saying basically you could rake that way, but you would come and have to manually bale it.
Most likely, unless you have the larger equipment for the baler. Yeah.
Okay.
The tree rows are typically about 10 foot apart. So most of your small compact farm tractors will fit down the rows.
Okay. And what you were saying about being able to sell out of state. So like if you were in South Carolina and wanting to sell to Georgia, though, you've got to get South Carolina DPI to sign off on that in order to be able to sell out of state.
Not to sell out of state, to transport out of state. So from a landowner's perspective, it really doesn't affect the landowner unless you are actually baling it, loading it, and hauling it across the state line. That really just falls on the contractor that is actually physically moving it across the state line to sell it. But yeah, in that case, they are required to contact DPI and have it inspected on. And of course, I can't say for sure they're inspecting every load, but they're probably not inspecting every load. They're probably, if I had to surmise, they're probably looking at the stand and get an idea of whether that stand has issues as opposed to inspecting an entire load.
Okay. But like if you were trying to sell in Georgia, for instance, is there anything you need to do from a Georgia standpoint?
Yeah, anytime it crosses the state lines, it has to go through DPI to get what you're moving inspected.
Okay. And I have not seen any other questions come in. So, if there are any last minute questions, go ahead and submit those. We can kind of cover those. Otherwise, this recording and all of our past webinars will be up on the YouTube channel, and you can check that if you'd like to review any of this information. Be on the lookout for maybe any upcoming programs in this area. If you have continued interest in this, you can certainly find Ryan's information, contact information through the Clemson Extension website. We do not know our upcoming topics yet for July and later down the road, but those should be announced fairly soon. We are going to have to change the webinar link, and that should automatically be done, and you might get a notification about that. But going forward, the webinar link may change for the future webinars. And Ryan just put his contact information into the chat if anybody would like to reach out for further information. So with that, we do appreciate it, Ryan, and we will hopefully see everyone on next month's webinar.